At the beginning of the franchise, bug-type Pokemon were often given the short end of the stick. Weaknesses to commonly used types, not enough bug-type moves, too many bug-type resistances, and very few viable final evolutions. But over time, the bug-type has been given a bit more love and attention. More powerful moves, more powerful Pokemon, and even stat buffs to older bug-type Pokemon to give them a fighting chance. Pokemon Sword and Shield continue this trend in the 8th generation, and these games have a plethora of decent bug-type Pokemon that can be utilized. So today, I'll be doing a hardcore Nuzlocke of Pokemon Sword with only bug-type Pokemon. Aside from the typical Nuzlocke rules, I will be playing on set mode at all times, I will not be using healing items in battle, and I cannot level my Pokemon past the level of a boss trainer's ace. And for this run, all bug-type Pokemon will be considered viable encounters, although there will be a few that will be leaving out for various reasons. I'm also going to allow Dynamax and Gigantamax just for fun, but I will most likely ban this mechanic in future playthroughs when I want a bigger challenge. Something to look forward to. So with that out of the way, let's start the run. Naturally, none of the starter Pokemon available to us at the start are bug-type, but I go ahead and pick Grookey as our starter. This will give us a neutral matchup when facing Hop throughout the game, but it will also give us a potentially more difficult matchup against Leon at the very end. So once we get through justifying the terrifying fairy tales told to European children by trekking through the woods and running afoul of ancient forest wolf spirits, I can finally get our true starter for the run by catching a Blipbug on Route 1. I name him Gideon, and his sassy nature will be pretty useful, giving him some extra special bulk. On the same route, I can also get 2 other encounters, Ragiera the Grubbin, who unfortunately has a careful nature, which will lower his eventually monstrous special attack once he's fully evolved, and Nicola the Caterpie, who quickly evolves into Butterfree and gives us an early game power advantage to easily take care of our second fight against Hop. Afterwards, Gideon evolves into Dottler, who has decent bulk for a bug type this early in the game. After more tutorial and story, we can finally get access to the wild area. Thanks to the introduction of wild Pokemon appearing in the overworld, we can easily spot a female combi in the rolling fields right away, who I name Marika. And in East Lake Axwell, I find a Dwebble I name Alexander. Next, I head over to the Isle of Armor DLC to get our next encounter in the Forest of Focus, a Venipede I name Melania. After that, we make our way through Route 3 and Galar Mine number 1 without much of an issue, while wiping Beat's Psychic-type team off the map with our team of bugs. This will be a reoccurring happenstance throughout the run. On Route 4, I catch a cutie fly I name Melina, and before I take on our first gym battle, I realize that there's actually another encounter we can get from the wild area that I missed. I head back during a thunderstorm, where I manage to find and catch a Joltik, which I name Fortisax. As you would expect with a team full of bug types, our first gym battle against Milo and his grass types is a walk in the park. A couple struggle bugs from Gideon easily takes care of Gossifleur, and Eldegoss can barely do any damage to him, even when Dynamaxed, thanks to his bulk and a light screen. So after winning an easy first badge, we move on to Route 5, and after nearly losing Alexander to the Reporter and Cameraman double battle, we get a bunch of new encounters and evolutions to fill out our team. Melania evolves into Whirlipede, Ragiera evolves into Chargerbug, and since I already have a Thunderstone picked up from the wild area, I get to immediately evolve him into Vikavolt. As for new encounters, I catch an Nincada I name Novelli, who quickly evolves into Ninjask. Last but not least, I catch a Dewpider I name Roderica, who quickly evolves into Araquanid. Her water typing and water bubble ability are going to be a very important component of the team for the rest of the run. After all that, we finally arrive in Holberry to face off against the next gym leader, Nessa, and her water types, who, like Milo, ends up being a breeze. Her Goldeen and Aracuda go down without an issue thanks to some strong Thunderbolts from Ragier, and since her Dreadnought lacks a Rock-type move to deal with super effective damage, Ragier is safe to go all out with a single Max Lightning for another one-hit KO, netting us another easy win. Guys, a Stab Thunderbolt with a base 145 special attack stat by the second gym is not a joking matter. I'd almost feel bad if it weren't so much fun to use. After having dinner with a middle-aged man who's barely wearing what could be considered pants, we head on to Galar Mine number 2 for our next couple of encounters. After leeching the life out of Bean's entire team with Roderica, I catch a Shuckle I named Trina, then a Wimpod I named Patches. After helping Hop fight off Team Yell, Melina evolves into Rabombi, and during the gym test in Motostoke, I take the opportunity to capture a Sizzlipede, which I name Mesmer. One would expect the fight against Kabu to be a bit tricky with a full team of bug types, but surprisingly, and also not surprisingly, everything goes down without a hitch. He starts with his Ninetales, and I start with Trina the Shuckle for her only fight of the run. After getting hit with a Will-O-Wisp, and subsequently getting healed with an attached Frostberry, she fulfills her singular purpose by setting up Stealth Rocks. I swap over to Roderica as Ninetales goes for another Will-O-Wisp on the switch-in, which Roderica's Water Bubble ability completely negates. A quick attack on the next turn does very little damage, and a Liquidation gets an easy one-hit KO. Arcanine comes out next, and after taking a huge chunk of Stealth Rocks damage and getting off a weak bite, another Liquidation gets us another easy KO. Centiskorch is last, and it immediately loses half of its HP from the Stealth Rocks. So after we both Dynamax, a single Max Geyser is more than enough to get us the win. With our third badge acquired, we can now move on to the rest of the wild area, where we can train up and get a bunch of evolutions. Mesmer evolves into Centiskorch, Gideon evolves into Orbeetle, Patches evolves into Golisopod, and Melania fully evolves into Scolipede. Next on Route 6, I catch a Durant named Thea, and while its speed-lowering, sassy nature is a bit disappointing, having a steel secondary typing is always a useful addition to the team. We then arrive at Stow-on-Side, and after another easy win against Hop, I take a brief detour to the training lowlands on the Isle of Armor for another encounter, a Scyther I name Morgott. While doing that, Alexander evolves into Crustle, and then Fortisax evolves into Galvantula, who by the way, is my favorite bug type of all time. We return to Stow-on-Side to take on our next gym challenge against Bea and her fighting types. I start the battle off by setting up a Reflect with Gideon holding a Light Clay, and a couple Psybeams easily takes care of her Hitmontop. Against Pangoro, I switch over to Melina, who's better able to handle its Dark-type attacks. A quad-effective Draining Kiss easily heals back the damage from the switch-in, and nearly gets a one-hit KO, as her Pangoro just goes for a workup. It ends up getting off a decently powerful Bullet Punch before Melina finishes it off with a Pollen Puff. Next up is Sirfetch'd, but it can't do much with an ineffectual Brutal Swing, and it too goes down with a couple more Draining Kisses. At this point our Reflect is finally gone, not so perfect timing as Bea sends out her ace Machamp. We both Dynamax, and I have Melina go for a Max Starfall. It does just a little bit more than half, as Machamp goes for a Max Strike that deals just a little bit less than half, while lowering Melina's speed. I decide to take a risk and keep her in to go for another Max Starfall, knowing that Ribombee is a pretty speedy Pokemon. She does end up attacking first, and somehow Machamp holds on with what looks like just one hit point. Machamp goes for another Max Strike, and it leaves Melina with just 8 HP. We're really cutting it close here. I decide to burn out our last turns of Dynamax by using Max Guard, since 2 speed drops may be enough for Machamp to outspeed now. I switch over to Patches, who easily tanks his strength before finishing the fight with a priority first impression. That was a close call, the closest so far, but the gamble paid off, getting us our 4th badge. After that, it's just a jump, skip, and hop to the 5th gym battle against Opal and her fairy types. I start the battle by setting up a Light Screen with Gideon, as her Weezing does next to nothing with the Sludge, and then a couple Psychics easily takes it down. Against Mawile, I switch over to Mesmer, who takes a Crunch that deals about a 4th. I answer her question correctly, so Mesmer gets a boost to his defenses, and a couple Scorching Sands is enough to take care of Mawile. Next up is Togekiss, and I decide to bring in Thea. She takes a little bit of damage from Ancient Power, which thankfully doesn't get the Omni Boost. A Metal Claw brings Togekiss down below half, and then Thea gets an attack boost from another correct answer. More than enough to easily take down her Togekiss, as well as her Gigantamaxed Alchemy with a single Max Steel Spike. Another easy gym badge acquired. After another fight against Hop, we move on to Route 8 where we can get our next encounter, a Snom I name Ronnie. Her impish nature isn't going to do her any favors, but a Bug Ice type is pretty unique, so I'll take it. I then head over to Challenge Beach on the Isle of Armor for our next encounter, which I happen to find in a den. Goldmask the Larvesta joins the team, and his timid nature is about as ideal of a nature as you can get for this particular encounter. Our 2 Moths are great last additions to the team, but they're pretty useless against the next gym leader, Gordy. Rock types can be tricky to deal with for a team full of bugs, but just like with Kabu, we're actually pretty well equipped to handle the challenge. Gordy's first Pokemon, Barbaracle, goes down in one hit from Melina's quad-effective Energy Ball. So next is Shuckle, and for some reason, despite Melina's stab moves being able to deal normal damage, I decide to go for another Energy Ball that ends up doing jack squat. After Shuckle goes for a pointless power swap, I switch over to Patches who tanks a critical hit Stone Edge. His HP manages to stay above half as I go for a waterfall that brings it into the red. It retaliates with a rock tomb that ends up activating his emergency exit, so Melina comes back out to finish his Shuckle off with a Pollen Puff. His Stonejourner goes down with one hit with an Energy Ball, so last is Colossal, our team's biggest threat. This could have been a dumb move, but I decide to risk keeping Melina in so she can get off a Charm as Colossal Gigantamaxes. But thanks to that attack drop, Melina can survive a Max Volcalith, which allows me to switch in Roderica to Dynamax. However, a 4 times effective Max Geyser isn't enough for a one-hit KO, thanks to Colossal setting up the Sun with a Max Flare. Not only that, it activates Colossal's Steam Engine ability, boosting its speed. Another Max Volcalith along with the chip damage afterwards brings Roderica down to her last third. But since Colossal's Gigantamax turns are used up, I decide to take another risk by staying in, hoping a regular powered attack won't be enough to take her down. And Colossal just goes for a Stealth Rock? Was the AI thinking I would switch out, or was it just dumb? Knowing how the AI tends to work in these games, it's probably the latter. Either way, one final Max Geyser finishes what is probably our toughest fight so far in this run to get our 6th badge. The next fight against Hop goes down as usual, until we run into trouble with his Corviknight. I switch to Fortisax, who gets his speed lowered with a Scary Face. On the next turn, the fact that the speed drop was enough for Fortisax to go second should have been my first red flag. The second Scary Face should have been another. The fact that I went for a Sticky Web thinking I needed it should have been a third, and the Drill Peck that followed, bringing her below half while under Hail, should have been the final clue that keeping her in is a bad idea. But when a Discharge ends up paralyzing Corviknight, I seem convinced that she'll outspeed. After Hop heals and another Discharge brings it back into the red, I'm somehow convinced that another Discharge should be enough. But even under Paralysis, those speed drops are enough for Corviknight to outspeed, and take out Fortisax with another Drill Peck, leaving me with my first death of this run. We finish the fight without any more issues, but losing Fortisax is devastating. As I mentioned before, Galvantula is probably my favorite bug type of all time, so losing her definitely hits hard. Either way, we need to keep going. After making another stop at the Isle of Armor for our final encounter of the run, an Excelgor named Lita, we continue on to Spikemuth, where after an unnoteworthy fight against Marnie, Ronnie is finally happy enough to evolve into Frostmoth. With that, we're finally ready to face Piers for the 7th badge. Melina starts the battle with a quad-effective Draining Kiss that gets a clean one-hit KO on his Scrafty. Next is his Malamar, and this time I'm going to be a bit more mindful of its contrary ability. I go for a Pollen Puff, and it ends up getting another one-hit KO with a critical hit. Nice. Obstagoon comes in and obstructs the next Pollen Puff, but the next puff brings it down to its last fourth. Shadow Claw does a bit of damage, and I then go for a Draining Kiss. He obstructs again, and since Draining Kiss is one of the rare special moves that makes direct contact, it ends up lowering Melina's defense. We go for another Draining Kiss that finally gets the KO and brings Melina back to full health, but the defense drop means we have to be careful with Piers' final Pokemon, Skuntank. So I go for a Charm to offset the defense drop, as his Skuntank just poisons Melina with Toxic. I switch over to Fia, and after a failed Sucker Punch on the switch, Fia dodges a Screech by going for Dig that ends up dealing over half damage. It then goes for a Desperate Snarl, and then we go for the kill with an Iron Head, surviving the aftermath damage and winning us our 7th badge. We finally make our return to Hammerlock to take on the 8th and final gym leader Raihan. Every fight leading up to this has been pretty easy to manageable, but the double battle against Raihan is notorious for being a thorn in a Nuzlocker's side. Here's hoping that I've prepared enough to get us through. Start with Gideon and Melina against his Gigalith and Flygon. The Sandstorm starts, as Melina gets off a Dazzling Gleam that deals more than half to Flygon, which retaliates with a strong, super effective Steel Wing that brings her below half. Gideon sets up a Reflect to give our team a fighting chance, as Gigalith sets up Stealth Rocks on my side. Not a good thing for my bug types. On the next turn, I switch out Gideon for Patches, and Melina finishes off Flygon with a Draining Kiss, getting back over half HP. But unfortunately, it's not nearly enough to take 3 hits from a Rock Blast, especially if you include a critical hit. I knew I would likely have to make a sacrifice for this fight, and while I expected it to be Melina, it still sucks. So I send out Rogier as Raihan brings in his Sandaconda, whose Earth Power deals very little damage to Patches. Rogier lets off an Energy Ball that just barely doesn't get the one-hit KO as I was hoping. So Patches will then need to finish it off with a Liquidation. Gigalith uses another Rock Blast that gets off all 5 hits, but Patches tanks it thanks to Gideon's Reflect from earlier, leaving him with just 6 HP. This activates his emergency exit, so I bring in Alexander as Raihan sends in his ace, his Dynamax Duraludon. I Dynamax Alexander, and after Rogier survives a Max Rocks Fall, I use Max Knuckle, which barely doesn't do a third. Rogier uses Energy Ball to bring his Gigalith down to his last third, but another Rock Blast is enough to finally take down Rogier. The Sandstorm reducing the damage to our special attacks is really not helping. I send Gideon back out, and another Max Rocks Fall brings Alexander down to about half. Gideon ends up being the one to get revenge for our fallen bug brethren by finishing off Gigalith with a Psychic, and Max Quake from Alexander just barely misses out on the KO, as both our Reflect and Raihan's Sandstorm finally end. Duraludon tries one more Max Rocks Fall on Gideon, which he survives on just 10 HP, as Alexander finally puts an end to the fight with one last Max Quake. Even knowing ahead of time that this was going to be a tough fight, it still stings losing 2 of my Pokemon, especially when they have been a part of the team since the early game. I can definitely look back and see where things might have gone wrong, but it's hard to say whether making another choice would have led to a better outcome. Just the way that Raihan's team is composed made this fight an uphill battle from the start, so I just need to adapt for later fights as best as I can. The first Champions Cup match against Marnie goes down without much of an issue. Malenia takes care of her Liepard with a Bug Bite, Morgot gets a chance to shine by taking down Scrafty with a dual Wing Beat, Malenia comes back to take out more Petco and Toxicroak with a couple Earthquakes, and a couple Max Oozes takes down Gigantamax Grimmsnarl. The final battle against Hop is a little more tricky. His double starts with a Cotton Guard, but because I'm running a special attacking Centiskorch, 2 Flamethrowers easily takes care of it. This leaves us in a good position to deal with his Corviknight, but instead of keeping the offensive momentum like a smart person would do, I decide to try playing it safe by going for a Will-O-Wisp, which ends up missing. It then lowers our speed with Scary Face and confuses with Swagger, but we manage to break through to get off a super effective Flamethrower that just barely doesn't get a one-hit KO. I make another misplay by switching over to Patches as Hop uses his full restore. A limp first impression and 2 drill picks later forces Patches out, so I bring in Mesmer to finish the job that should have been done a few turns ago. Next is Snorlax, and this time a Will-O-Wisp manages to hit. I bring in Alexander, who tanks a high horsepower, then a Body Press leaves him with a Sliver, but the Rocky Helmet Chip after a Heavy Slam finishes the job. After that, an Earthquake just barely misses out, knocking out his Pincurchin, so he's forced to take a good chunk of damage from a Thunderbolt, before a second Earthquake finally takes it out. Last is Dynamaxed Inteleon, so I switch to Roderica, who tanks a Max Geyser before she Dynamaxes herself. She tanks a Max Darkness, then gets off a Max Flutterby, which brings it below half while lowering its special attack. Thanks to that, Roderica can survive one last Max Darkness without a problem, and one more Max Flutterby gets the KO, and our second Champion Cup victory. With 2 tournament wins under our belt, we now have to deal with Oleana and her toxic fixation with her boss that she decided to make our problem for some reason. Mesmer roasts her Frostlass with a Flamethrower, as I bring in Roderica to deal with Milotic. I fish for a defense drop with Crunch, which does activate Milotic's competitive ability, but it has nothing that can actually threaten her. A couple Leech Lives easily takes out Milotic while keeping Roderica relatively healthy. Which is good, as I risk keeping her in against Serena, who ends up bringing her into the red with an itemless Acrobatics. I switch in Alexander, who eats up a couple more Acrobatics thanks to his Rock typing, and allows the Rocky Helmet Chip to finish her off. Those Acrobatics were enough to bring him below half though, so I go back to Mesmer, who gets poisoned with a Poison Gas from her Salazzle. He gets hit with a nasty Venoshock, but a quad-effective Scorching Sands takes her out, and all that's left is a Gigantamax Gorboder, but now we have a major problem. It knows a Rock-type move, so a Max Rockfall will be devastating to whoever switches in. Our one team member that is neutral to Rock is not healthy enough to take a hit, so I make a decision to swap in Lita for her battle debut, but naturally, the only thing she can do is take the hit, a one-hit KO. But her sacrifice allows me to bring in Gideon safely so he can Dynamax. I waste its second Gigantamax turn with a Max Guard, then go for a Max Mindstorm to bring it into the red. It gets off one last Max Rockfall, but Gideon is bulky enough to survive with just over half HP. Gorboder reverts to his regular size, and one more Max Mindstorm easily takes it out, getting us the win. Next up is the fight against Bede. A Flamethrower from Mesmer easily dispatches his Mawile, and I bring in Morgot against his Gardevoir. It just goes for a Wish as he comes in, so the next turn I decide to go for a Swords Dance. It goes for a Greedy Calm Mind, so we can get an easy KO with Next Scissor, and the same goes for his Rapidash. So last is Gigantamax Hatterene, and I know ahead of time that this thing packs a Fire-type move, which threatens most of my team. So I switch over to Alexander to tank Max Flare, but it does bring him below half, while setting up the Sun. I have no choice but to switch over to Roderica, who I know can take another Max Flare much better thanks to her higher special defense. But his Hatterene instead goes for G-Max Smite, which does bring her below half, and confuses. There's only one more turn of Gigantamax left, so I could switch to another Pokemon, but that would either risk a Sun-boosted Max Flare completely destroying my team members, or another G-Max Smite could deal a significant amount of damage. So I go for a Max Guard to eat up her last turn, and she breaks through the confusion and blocks the attack. Hatterene returns to normal size, and I go for a Max Flutterby, but this time we're not so lucky, and Roderica hits herself in confusion, while Hatterene brings her into the red with a Psychic. I assume she'll go for another Psychic, so I switch over to Gideon to tank the hit as the Sun finally ends, giving us a bit more breathing room. I go for Bug Buzz, but it's still not enough to finish the job, as Hatterene gets off a super effective but thankfully unboosted Mystical Fire. He survives, but he gets the special attack drop. Bee then uses a full restore, but another Bug Buzz ends up getting a lucky crit. Now is the perfect time to bring Mesmer back in, who blocks the next Mystical Fire with his Flash Fire ability. Thanks to that, the power of Mesmer's Flamethrower is boosted, allowing us to finally take care of Hatterene and win the fight. Next up is our rematch against Nessa, and I decide to be a bit cheeky this time around. I start with Nefeli for her official debut, protecting on the first turn to get a speed boost, then a Swords Dance right after. I was expecting her Golisopod would attack, knowing she would survive with a Health Focus Sash, but it instead goes for its own Swords Dance. So instead of Baton passing out right away, I keep her in to get off a strong Aerial Ace, activating its emergency exit. Pelipper comes in and starts the rain, and since Nefeli is still healthy, I go for another Swords Dance. Pelipper sets up a Tailwind, but another turn of stalling with Protect gets us at +5 speed, more than enough to negate the speed advantage. So now I finally Baton Pass over to Fia, who takes a fairly strong Air Slash as the rain ends. And with the speed and attack boost transferred, Fia proceeds to completely sweep the rest of her team. So on to the rematch against Bee. Starting with Melania against her Hawlucha, she outspeeds to deal some decent damage with the Poison Jab, while Hawlucha goes for Bounce, which we can protect the next turn to completely block it. The next Poison Jab actually gets a high roll, getting us a clean KO. Next up is Phalanx, and I keep Melania in for another Poison Jab, which manages to poison. It uses a Bulk Up, and another Poison Jab leaves it in the red. But soon I realize that this won't be the most efficient strategy, as it uses No Retreat to boost all of its stats, and then Bee uses a full Restore to completely heal it. We're now back to square one, but I'm a bit stubborn, so I keep Melania in to fish for more poison, which she manages to do after a couple more Poison Jabs. A strong Rock Tomb brings her below half, and I protect the next turn to stall out more poison damage. With the speed drop, it's no longer safe to keep her in, so I switch over to Patches, who tanks a boosted close combat pretty well. So thanks to the defense drops and residual poison, Patches can finally take it down with a priority first impression. Well, I guess I overestimated Patches' strength here. The Phalanx just goes for another No Retreat, and lets itself die from the poison? I suppose that is the Spartan way, I guess. Either way, the fight continues as Sirfetch'd comes in, and it goes for a Leaf Blade, which barely misses out on activating Patches' emergency exit, so he can get off a Liquidation. Assuming a Leaf Blade won't kill with a crit, I keep Patches in to get off a Sucker Punch, bringing it below half before Patches makes a tactical retreat. I bring in Nefeli, who protects against a Slam to get an easy speed boost, then uses Aerial Ace to take Sirfetch'd out. Grapple Locked is next, and I have Nefeli Baton Pass to Gideon, who gets locked in thanks to Nuzlocke, but the truth is, he's locked in here with us. I have Gideon set up a Reflect, but a Mega Punch gets a critical hit, bringing him to about half HP before Leftovers recovery. So I decide to Dynamax first, and let loose with a one-hit KO with a Max Mindstorm. Last is Bee's Gigantamax Machamp, who nearly takes Gideon down with a Max Flare, but a couple more Max Mindstorms gets the job done. Next up is Raihan, who starts off the battle with a Sun-setting Torkoal. I start with Patches dealing okay damage with a Sun-weakened Liquidation, but a yawn forces me to switch over to Gideon, who barely gets a tickle from a one-turn Solar Beam. I use Protect to stall out a turn of Sun, but a Psychic the next turn misses out on the KO, so Gideon ends up taking a good chunk of damage from a Lava Plume. I make a mistake by protecting when Raihan uses a full restore, so I have to switch out the next turn. I bring in Patches, who just gets hit with another yawn. I don't really want to deal with that, so I switch to Roderica instead, who can take a Lava Plume much better. Without the Sun, Roderica can use Liquidation to finally take care of Torkoal. Goodra's next and uses Rain Dance, as a leech life deals a bit over a third. I then switch over to Ronnie for her chance at glory. She does have to tank a strong Thunder and Surf before she can get the KO with an Ice Beam, but this was necessary to bait in his Turtonator with the rain still up. Roderica comes back out as Turtonator wastes its turn with an untriggered Shell Trap. A couple liquidations later, and down goes Turtonator. Next is Flygon, which sets up the Sandstorm, but Roderica isn't having any of it, as she lets loose a critical hit liquidation for a one-hit KO. I was kind of hoping to stall out the Sandstorm a bit, as Raihan's Gigantamax Duraludon will be tougher to deal with it up. It can hit my entire roster hard, so we have to switch things up to stall out its 3 turns. I bring in Alexander just to switch to Patches, who actually stays above half health, but the Sandstorm damage ends up triggering his emergency exit, so in comes Melania, who gets the honor of Dynamaxing for this fight. After max guarding Duraludon's last turn, Melania thankfully dodges a Stone Edge and lets loose a couple Max Quakes to win us the fight. Before we could take on Leon, Chairman Rose does something most CEOs don't do. Actually tries to solve a problem ailing society from the goodness of his heart. The problem is, he does it in the most stupid and destructive way possible. So just in time to take on his steel types, Goldmax evolves into Volcarona, Quiver Dances, and completely dominates Rose's entire team with ease. And after we help the 2 wolves bring down a Bloodborne boss, it's finally time to take on the champion and prove the true worth of the bug type. Our starter pick gave Leon 2 fire types, theoretically making it our hardest matchup at this run. For my final team, I've decided to bring Alexander the Crustle, Goldmask the Volcarona, Roderica the Araquanid, Melania the Scolipede, Fia the Durant, and Patches the Golisopod. I'm confident this final team setup will be more than prepared to take on the final and most difficult challenge of the game. So here we go. We start the fight with Alexander setting up Stealth Rocks, and sadly, this is all he can really do, as Leon's Aegislash immediately knocks him out with a Flash Cannon. But, much like the battle against Kabu, Stealth Rocks will be our insurance in case something goes wrong. Except, nothing actually goes wrong. I bring Goldmask out to set up a Quiver Dance, as Aegislash wastes a turn reverting to Shield form. We pull off another Quiver Dance next turn, which helps reduce the damage of a Shadow Ball. But we're not stopping here. I go for another Quiver Dance, and another Quiver Dance, and with that, Goldmask then takes out Seismitoad, Haxorus, and Dragapult with a few Bug Buzzes, and a Hurricane against Cinderace that thankfully doesn't miss. And after Leon's Charizard comes out and loses 50% of its HP thanks to Alexander's sacrifice, I Dynamax, click on Max Airstream, and seal our victory. And with that, I have officially beaten Pokemon Sword with only Bug-type Pokemon. That might have been a cheap way to win, but I like to think that all is fair in Nuzlocke runs, as long as you adhere to the rules you place for yourself. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, I would really appreciate it if you like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I have many more videos in the works, so I hope you stick around. Thank you for watching.